I'm really happy to be here. I would love to thank Kapwani and Gaetan for having me here. I am not an economist, and I don't speak about goods or things. And the title of this session is about movements and roads. And when I had to think about what I was doing with movements and roads, I just discovered that I never think about movement. And what I would love to try with you is to wander, to walk through a kind of a imaginary map of a false movement of, liberation. Okay, there are many ways to tell a story, many ways to tell a story of violence. And of course, the most striking way to tell such story is to draw a map. Because stories of violence are usually stories of movements, of roads, of attempted flights, or trajectories. So we can map the roads of violence followed by the extraction and the commodification of certain goods. But we can also map the movements of human facing violence, that is to say, facing process of thingification. And we have this philosopher, Simone Weil, a French philosopher, which I really love, that in her text, she was written in the 30s, which is a rereading of the Iliad from Homer, where she's trying to understand what a process of thingification is. And this process is when a human is considered as a workforce, a slave, a thing, a good, or a corpse. So we can map the process of thingification, but we can also map the process of resistance to thingification, the process of refusal. There are movements of resistance and refusals, and it is interesting to consider how does a human move when he refuses to be considered as a thing. How do a human move? So I would love to describe here, so this is an intellectual attempt. I would love to describe here those attempts of movement as false movements. That is to say, false movements that undo themselves, that cancel themselves, movements that call for their own negation as movement. What does that mean? Those movements of fugitivity and of refusal are can usually be interpreted through their aim, and their aim usually is rest and immobility. These are movements longing for rest. So I would love to try to map the road of rest, and what kind of movement do we do perhaps when we are longing for rest, and how rest can be part of an emancipatory process of a language of emancipation. And I will start with in a very bad way. I'm sorry for that, because I know that we usually think through Black radical imaginations and Black radical thought, rooted in the tension between Marxism and Blackness, etc. But, and you can just, I'm going to be a little provocative, if you accept that. I love to think also through Black conservative tradition, nationalist tradition, sometimes heavily racialist, and I'm sorry for that. But in those Black conservative traditions, you have a really strong understanding of what being free means and what kind of movements you have to do. In the contemporary human sciences, especially at the end of the 20th century, through the work of Edouard Glissant, through the work of Gilroy, through the work of Stuart Hall, the idea of blackness as a utopia had to embody a movement. To be black is to be a movement, an emancipatory movement in itself. But when those thinkers were just trying to interpret the idea of blackness, they were doing it also against a black conservative narrative, trying to root blackness in a continent. And this is through staticity, through a static position. And of course, one of the biggest map that was drawn in the 20th century in the black conservative tradition was the map drawn by Marcus Garvey, which is absolutely intense, provocative, and strong. Why does the map of Marcus Garvey and his absolutely powerful company of the Black Star Line show us? What kind of map are they doing? The map they are drawing is a very specific map because in those traditions, in those black conservative traditions, there are a lot of onirical images and ideas of movement. Okay, sometimes from a more authoritarian and conservative intellectual traditions, but the refusal of thingification is always linked to a dream of rest. Dreaming of rest can be seen as a freedom dream. In this dream, movement is not cancelled, but has a specific meaning. The flight is not an indefinite movement. It has an end. We have to find a refuge, a static position, a static situation. So the ships of the Black Star Line had to contribute to only one movement and one map, a simple go with no coming back. The movement is the return to Africa, to take the opposite direction of the slave ship. The slave ship was carrying men and women and slaves being things, and the Black Star Line ships must carry men and women reconstructing their genealogies by coming back home, by reinscribing themselves in the density of a history. By coming back to Africa, black doesn't mean being non-white, a human versus a thing. Black means being African, which says that race is a diasporic sign. Global blackness is a diasporic sign. Race is a diasporic sign gathering the scattered children, this is an expression from Marcus Garvey, of Africa longing for a place of refuge, a land. I would love to quote Marcus Garvey, if you allow me. This is in a strong. I didn't put the right quotation. It doesn't matter. It's you can find it in the Philosophy and Opinions of Marcus Garvey, the texts that were gathered by his wife Amy Jack Garvey. And there is a discourse that was pronounced in New York in 1924. This is a discourse at the Madison Square Garden. And Marcus Garvey says that he's talking about the Universal Negro Association, Improvement Association. So the Universal Negro Improvement Association represents the hopes and aspirations of the awakened Negro. Our desire is for a place in the world, not to disturb the tranquility of other men, but to lay down our burden and rest our weary backs and feet by the banks of the Niger, and sing our songs and chant our hymns to the God of Ethiopia. Yes, we want rest from the toil of centuries, rest of political freedom, rest of economic and industrial liberty, rest to be socially free and unmolested, rest from lynching and burning, rest from discrimination of all kinds. To go back to Africa is to take the road of rest. Africa, described in the Garvey's movement, is considered as a land of refuge for the Black people who are strangers in strange lands, USA, Europe, etc. So the language of Garvey is heavily racialist and conservative, but it allows us to understand the distinction between free movements and forced movements of flight. The possibility of rest, the possibility to stop a movement, is at the core of languages and practices of refusal. The refusal of the thingification process to escape from the possibility to be considered as a good. The sheep in the imaginary of freedom does not always embody the continuity of a movement echoing the waves of the sea, but it also embodies a longing for rest that requires the static solidity of a land. This idea of rest as a freedom dream is also at the core of other languages of liberation that are, this time, at the core of my research. But the imaginary of longing for rest is really coming in my work from the Black conservative tradition embodied by the work of Marcus Garvey, with all the difficulties, of course, but this is where it comes from. So my work focuses on a specific period of our contemporary times, the 60s. Okay, that's not so contemporary, and especially the history not of the global Blackness and the global Black traditions, but the history of Africa and especially Central Africa. And what I want to understand is what are when the people wanted to be independent, what did they reclaim through the word independence? And I would love to call those traditions of thought and political practices through an expression that transforms the words of Robin D.J. Kelley, and I would call them African radical imagination. And I think that during the 60s, the African continent has blossomed through African radical imagination, especially through the word, not decolonization, which is a very important word for us today, but through another word which is a lot more important, the word independence. And in the word independence, you can see signs or manifestations of this language of rest. To get independence is to rest. And this idea of rest is at the core of what a freedom dream can be, and more precisely, the dream of independence could be. Because movement usually is linked to colonial violence, and I'm going to be very metaphoric. I'm sorry, these are just to open a conversation, but it would be interesting to describe the violence of a colony through the trope of the movement and to understand what is a colonial violence through the idea of forced movements, and to just see what are the concentration of forced movements that can describe what a colony is. And I would love to focus on a country which is close to me because it's a country of my father, which is the RC. So a country where I live a large part of my family. So if you want to do a little bit of history, I am not a historian, so I'm sorry for the discipline, really. But Central Africa encounters with the West started in the 15th century. And it opened, and I want to quote a Congolese historian called Isidore Ndaiwel, it opened an extraordinary cycle of violence. This is a quote from Ndaiwel. So the slave trade developed after the arrival of the Portuguese in the Congo in 1483. And the forced movements of kidnapping and enslavements, along with the drain on the labor force, destabilized local institutions and demographies. African lands were turned into a huge reservoir of manual labor, filling trade channels that were becoming increasingly international at that moment. In the Congo Basin, then, with becoming the property of the King of Belgium at the end of the 19th century, rubber exploitation led to violent forms of extractivism, That included, and I will enumerate them, destruction of villages, appropriation of land and forced displacement, massacre and mutilation of local populations, destabilization of collective life, forced labor, etc., etc. This circle of depredation are being reconfigured in our contemporary times, as Denise Ferreira da Silva said in her talk. And we must be able to reinterpret from a vital standpoint this type of violence. The life of some requires the death of others. Our societies of superabundance imply the extinction of societies that function exclusively as a reservoir of energy and material. But let's come back to the 60s and the idea of independence I was talking about. In the 60s, the ongoing dreams of independence were built to destroy the colonial reality of a colony, understood as zones of infralife, and infralife could be seen as a forced movement, a concentration of forced movements. And the dreams of independence were built to prevent from the post-colonial nightmares we are living in today. But after the failure of independence, embodied by the assassination of Lumumba, the Congolese youth continued to nurture the dream of independence in the late 60s. And a strange text, really strange text, was written in 1969 by revolutionary youth. This strange text, I cannot translate that in English. I will try. The Manifesto of the Proletarian Brotherhood of revolutionary Congolese that are peasant, workers, intellectuals, and students. So this text is absolutely interesting because it tried to reinvent what had not happened, to reinvent the Congo as a land, as an independent land. And what does that mean to live in an independent land? It means to have rest. And the text in itself can be seen as a text that describes what is the type of life that can have rest, from violence, rest from destruction, and rest from displacement. And the possibility of rest means not being forced to move and must be understood through a connection in this text through the land, the food, and the dead. What does that mean? To have rest is correlated to another action, to eat. To eat. This is a dramatic PowerPoint. So when you don't move, you have the possibility to do one thing, you have the possibility to plow the land. And as the dead are buried, to eat the food coming from the land is also a connection with the ancestors. This is not a super strange mythology coming from the south. You find this also in other mythology, in Western Europe, etc. The connection between the food, the land, and the dead. But here, what is interesting is that to rest is to be nurtured by such a connection. The movement is a destruction of this possible connection between the dead, the food, and the land. And what is interesting in this manifesto, and this will be my last word, is that this reflection on false movement I'm trying to draw becomes a reflection about food, not good, but food. That is to say, a reflection focusing on what sustains the very possibility of a human existence. So the radical imaginations of independence were dreams of food, that is to say, of sustainability, in both the physical and the spiritual sense, and to plow the land. And if you want to plow the land, you need to have rest from extractivism and forced displacement, rest from being raped and forced to leave your house or your country, rest to be socially free and unmolested, as would say Marcus Garvey. So through those radical dreams, we I think we perhaps have to think about the possibility to think of rest and perhaps of a false movement as a revolutionary option. Thank you.